Let me join Lachlan and Elad in thanking you all for coming to the session. It's always a great privilege to have people hear your paper, so we are really grateful that you came along. I was both overjoyed and horrified to hear Lachlan's paper. It's all good, don't worry. Overjoyed because you're talking about exactly the same bit of Anti-Oedipus that I am, and horrified because I think you've thought about it a lot more than I have. I'm mainly a sort of Michel Serres scholar, and I'm trying to bolt a bit of Deleuze and Guattari onto that in this paper, which is going to become, I think, painfully clear as we go on. If you're the sort of person who likes to know where you're going, here's my paper in 5 sentences. Number 1, the state of nature is really problematic. Number 2, Deleuze and Guattari try to rewrite it in a radically political way. Number 3, Michel Serres tries to rewrite it in a radically ecological way. Number 4, but hold on, both of those trajectories were already present in it. Number 5, so are they really subverting it in the way they think they are, or are they actually just continuing the tradition of the state of nature in their writing? That's the arc. So it's a paper about modernity, I guess, both its pathologies and its promise, and how difficult it is to gain a critical distance from this thing that we call Western modernity. I'm going to approach it through one of its central motifs, which is this idea of the state of nature. It's been called variously the central myth of modernity. It's been called the founding myth of modernity in various different critical works. It's been claimed that the state of nature helped make the modern world. So when we look at the state of nature, it's not some peripheral or esoteric notion. It is something that is at the heart of whatever it is that Western modernity is doing. And therefore, as Serres and Deleuze and Guattari rethink the state of nature, they are to some extent rethinking the whole modern Western tradition of which this state of nature is central. So let's begin then with Anti-Oedipus. I'm going to focus my attention, as did Lachlan, on the section titled in the English translation, Savages, Barbarians, Civilized Men. It's 10 chapters of Anti-Oedipus, and it progresses through this threefold savage, barbarian, civilized schema, the schema that itself replaced the state of nature motif in the early 19th century. And despite the book's persistent critique of the state of nature idea, I want to try and show that the text actually reinscribes many of the theoretical gestures of the state of nature in its own approach. Let's start with the savage. In the savage socius, as Lachlan was so eloquently helping us to understand earlier, flows of desire are immanently coded onto territory and social relations without a centralized state. This includes the regulation of flows by things like marriage and kinship, and exchanges within structured territorial systems, avoiding any form of free or decoded flows that could destabilize the social fabric. And this coding of flows in the savage socius is described in these chapters as territorialization, the circumscription of those flows within certain bounds and practices, affiliations and alliances and meanings. And even in this earliest form of the socius, for Deleuze and Guattari, there's no pure chaotic nature. Nature is already always coded. And this is in sharp contrast, I think, to the state of nature in Rousseau's discourse on inequality, where the pure state of nature, as he calls it, the first moment of the state of nature, is ostensibly devoid of all codes. There's no language, there's no filiation, there's no families, to respond to a previous question, there's no trade. But, and this is where it begins to get really interesting, it is analogous to Thomas Hobbes' state of nature in Leviathan chapter 13. The first paragraph of the introduction to Leviathan reads as follows. Nature, brackets, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, close brackets, is, by the art of man, as in many other things, so in also this imitated, that it can make an artificial animal, close quote. What's going on here? Well, Hobbes's nature, he's placarding up front, is an artifice. Nature is not natural in the sense of unconstructed. Nature is God's artifice. It's artificial all the way down and it's artificial all the way back. Just as, for Deleuze and Guattari, nature is coded seemingly, in these chapters, all the way down and all the way back. Moving on now to the barbarian. Deleuze and Guattari's second stage of barbarians describes, again as Lachlan was so very lucidly showing us a moment ago, despotic regimes. Both the Leviathan, Hobbes's Leviathan, and Deleuze and Guattari's despot represent a central figure of power that radically reorganize social relations by concentrating authority in one entity, and they both impose new sets of laws and codes on society. Again, it's the idea of overcoding that Lachlan was talking about. In Hobbes's account, the sovereign's will is the source of all law, Leviathan's will, which its subjects must obey in exchange for protection from the dangers of the state of nature. It's a classic social contract. In Anti-Oedipus, by contrast, the despot similarly seizes control of flows that circulated in former savage societies and that were regulated by territorial systems, and redefines social alliances and kinship and production in terms of this idea of a centralized authority. However, while Hobbes hails the legitimacy and even the necessity of this Leviathan figure as a way to ward off social chaos, Deleuze and Guattari, of course, frame the despot as part of a repressive apparatus that stifles desire and freedom. And this then is the great difference between the two accounts. Not in what they describe, but in the judgment they pass on what they describe. Hobbes's sovereign Leviathan is in his eyes, neat political solution designed to maintain peace and order, grounded in a view of human nature as inveterately self-interested and competitive. Deleuze and Guattari, on the other hand, are concerned with how power operates and flows within social and economic systems, how desire is repressed, how hierarchies are maintained. And their anthropology is much closer, though of course not identical, to a Rousseauian conception in which the basic sentiments of pity and amour de soi, like a healthy desire for self-preservation, are fundamentally good. And their despot is also much closer to Rousseau's tyrant towards the end of the discourse on inequality, who rules over what Rousseau calls a new state of nature that follows the descent of civil society into decadence and extreme inequality. So we've done savage, we've done barbarian. Now let's have a look at the chapters in Anti-Oedipus that deal with civilization. Hobbes, of course, has only two stages in his development. There's the state of nature, and then there's the commonwealth, the civil society, that follows it. But Deleuze and Guattari add a third, civilization, which they identify, of course, with capitalism. Just as the despotic machine overcoded the flows of desire in the savage socius, so capitalism also deterritorializes and reterritorializes the flows of the despotic regime itself. Under capitalism, the process of coding is replaced by what Deleuze and Guattari call axiomatization, where flows of desiring production are no longer inscribed on the earth, as they were in the savage state, nor commanded by the despot, but regulated by abstract economic laws and principles, like supply and demand and profit maximization. And this repeated decoding and overcoding raises a question, I think, for savages, barbarians, and civilized men itself. Namely, to what extent is Deleuze and Guattari's own relationship to the state of nature tradition one precisely of overcoding and axiomatization? In rejecting the rule of capital, are they aping its modus operandi in their own analysis? Now, there's at least a prima facie case, I wouldn't want to put it any stronger than that, to suggest that the process they describe occurring in the despotic and capitalist socius also characterizes their own relationship to the universal history that they reject. After all, they retain Lewis Henry Morgan's three-phase account of social development, moving through savagery, barbarism, and civilization. They persist in using the term universal history. They write about the emergence and development of the socius, and they do so in a way that replaces Hobbes's diffidence, competition and vainglory from Leviathan 13 with desiring production, and the social contract with despotic overcoding. And I'll return to this haunting of a similarity when I come to the conclusion of the paper. Before I do that, though, I want to move on to Michel Serres, who also rewrites the state of nature, but does so, I think, rather differently. His critique of the state of nature, other than exposing its control and its co-option of desire, stresses the dangers inherent in restricting our understanding simply to human relations, simply to the human socius. In other words, his is an ecological state of nature. He writes, for example, that the theorists of the social contract are, quote, strangely silent about the world, the non-human world, and that the contract is our pretext for forgetting all about the non-human. Quote, as if the group that had signed it, casting off from the world, were no longer rooted in anything but its own history, close quote. He rightly points out that the state of nature that Hobbes describes in Leviathan 13 is overwhelmingly a matter of human nature, with scant reference to the non-human world. The only one I could find in Leviathan 13 was a passing reference to the fact that in the state of nature there's no culture of the earth. With Rousseau, by contrast, we do see natural agency beginning to be folded into human affairs. But Serres departs from both Rousseau and Hobbes, as well as from Deleuze and Guattari, I think, when he frames the state of nature in terms of a primordial noise and turbulence. It's a Lucretian register at this moment. He's talking about the formation of matter and the sort of atoms falling in the void and the clinamen, that level of the genesis of things. Now, the main difference here is not in the basic grammar of noise and turbulence themselves. You can find that sort of language in Deleuze and Guattari, but it's in the way that Serres situates this turbulence much further back than Hobbes does, or Rousseau, or Deleuze and Guattari in these chapters on savage, barbarian, and civilization. And so rather than focusing on the socius, Serres is concerned with ecosystems, including biotic and inanimate structures and objects, in a way that situates the state of nature, his state of nature, in a resolutely ecological register. And the second thing that's different about Serres' state of nature, the first was ecology, the second is that the main figure that through which he understands the state of nature is the figure of the parasite. Noise, which for Serres is very close to the idea of the parasite, is interwoven into the state of nature and fed all the way through it. There are two other senses of parasite. So the first is noise. Le parasite in French can be both noise and static on a line and a parasite. The second sense is the biological sense of parasite, an organism that lives off another. And the third sense of parasite that Serres conjures with in the book of that name is the parasite in the sense of an uninvited dinner guest. It's common in Roman literature. And these three senses together provide with a notion of universal history that encompasses but far surpasses the human socius, developing what he calls the hard, sort of biotic life, physical, material life, and also the soft, immaterial entities such as information and language. And Serres' reflections on the parasitic state of nature are often oblique. He doesn't have a nice 10 chapters like Deleuze and Guattari do in Anti-Oedipus, where he unpacks this in a sort of systematic way. But I think it is possible to cobble together from different things that he writes a sense of the way that he reimagines the state of nature along the lines of ecology and the parasite. For Serres, the parasite is the third element in any social relation. It mediates between individuals and groups, and in doing so, it creates a kind of social complexity that prevents society from ever achieving a stable equilibrium. For Serres, every society, every collectivity is constituted through this excluded parasitic third. And his fundamental parasitism is different, I think it's safe to say, from Deleuze and Guattari's fundamental coding and flows in two key ways. First of all, in Anti-Oedipus, the deterritorialization and reterritorialization, or axiomatization, are driven by particular ends. The despot's self-serving quasi-deification, or the expansion and reign of capital. But for Serre, parasitic relations are unscripted, they're aleatory, they're non-teleological. And the second big difference, I think, is that by implication, Deleuze and Guattari's analysis lends itself much more obviously, much more easily, to a posture of political critique than does Serre's. Their theory remains explicitly tied to critiquing the status quo, critiquing what capitalism is doing, understanding how power operates through coding and the reterritorialization of desire, providing tools for critiquing capitalist and despotic systems. In contrast, Serre's account, though it's deeply imaginative and rich in its treatment of physical processes, lacks the obvious cutting edge of Deleuze's and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. By virtue of focusing on turbulence and natural flows and material deviations, Serre can be seen, and indeed has often been seen, as presenting a more apolitical, even a quietist version of the state of nature. So one way of understanding what's at stake in these two rewritings of the state of nature, and it touches on Guattari's chaosmos that was mentioned in response to one of the earlier papers, is to what extent is it possible to rethink the state of nature today in a way that is both politically incisive and radically ecological at the same time? I think that's one of the questions that's raised by the theme of the paper. I'm not going to answer it now, but we can come back to it in the questions if that's something that interests you. I want to try and conclude with two thoughts that wrap up these ideas. And they both come out of one question. The question is this: how do the reimagined states of nature in Anti-Oedipus and the Parasite relate to the classical state of nature accounts in Hobbes and Rousseau? The answer, I think, is complexly and problematically. Because the Parasite and Anti-Oedipus do certainly subvert the state of nature motif. I'm not suggesting there's any simple sort of linear read across from Hobbes and Rousseau to Deleuze, Guattari and Serre. But at the same time, they also reproduce and fulfill a number of the features that are inherent to the state of nature, in the sense that they continue the trajectory that's already discernible as an evolution within the state of nature motif over time. I try and put a bit of flesh on those bones. So Hobbes, seeking to establish his account of human origin and development, is already subverting the Aristotelian model of nature that was common in his moment. The idea of nature as the telos of society, not the origin of society, of the zoon politikon of Aristotle. Rousseau, for his part, establishes his own state of nature account largely by subverting Hobbes and Pufendorf and Locke, previous state of nature theorists, and by subverting the idea of the Hobbesian natural condition. So what? So, this idea of subverting orthodoxy is hard-baked into the state of nature motif from its very beginning in modernity. That is what the state of nature does. It subverts whatever is orthodox at the time. So therefore, when Deleuze and Guattari and Serre come along and try to subvert the state of nature tradition, they are performing a gesture that is crucial to that same tradition. And there's also a trajectory from Hobbes to Rousseau, a trajectory of a greater acknowledgement of the non-human world. Rousseau's state of nature is much more ecological than Hobbes's is. And there's also a trajectory of an increasing critique of the political status quo, of modernity. Rousseau's state of nature is really, and especially his first discourse of the arts and sciences, excoriates modern culture. And so given that trajectory is already there in the state of nature idea, that is what the state of nature does, to what extent can we say that it therefore subverts the state of nature idea to continue doing those things to the state of nature itself? That's the tension that I want to offer through our thinking. So both classical state of nature texts and their more recent imaginings challenge and transcend the rigid, fixed ways of thinking of their own day. In the case of the classical state of nature thinkers, the movements away from theological and metaphysical origins towards a more secular materialist understanding. With Deleuze and Guattari, it's a move away from the psychoanalytic and structuralist views of society and of the family towards an understanding of human subjectivity and social dynamics that's fluid and always in motion. For Serre, it's the move away from a narrowly anthropocentric conception of the socius towards a decentered ecological plane of biotic and non-biotic ideal entities. And this brings us to my very final question, and with this I promise I'll be finishing. Are Anti-Oedipus and the parasite, therefore, in fact, subverting the state of nature at all? Or are they faithfully continuing a trajectory that it has already been on for 2 centuries now? The question, of course, is ill-posed, because they're doing both, as far as I can see. And any adequate account of their relationship to the classical state of nature thinkers must take account of both of these. Their disposition to the state of nature is one that, if we had to try and put a label on it, we might call subversive fulfillment. It's a way of subverting a pattern or a concept, but while perpetuating some of its key processes. If you think of a pattern as something fixed, like an integer, and a process as something transformative, like an algorithm, the process performs an operation on whatever it encounters. The parasite and Anti-Oedipus, in this context, subvert the pattern of the state of nature while fulfilling its processes, which leaves them, I think, ambiguously situated in relation to the state of nature, and therefore to the heritage of the modernity at which the state of nature sits at the heart. In their very attempts to distance themselves from the state of nature and to subvert it, they are also, and this doesn't cancel out the subversion, but they are also perpetuating and ultimately fulfilling it. Thank you.